Al Floss presents the complete and alarming history of America's greatest garage band, the Stools.
1957 was a banner year for the Stools, and for music in general. It was the year that the late John Lennon and Sir Paul McCartney met. But of course, Paul wasn't a knight yet, and John wasn't dead yet.
Good morning, daylight.
I always remember 1957. It was the year that Dr. Seuss's Cat in the Hat was published, and Al Floss always wanted to get that on Broadway, and they all laughed at him. Well, who's laughing now? Well, I mean, if he had had anything to do with getting it on Broadway.
Good morning, Rocky J. Squirrel. Good morning, Bullwinkle Moose.
The Stools' sophomore slump was the first double album I remember buying. Of course, that was long before I started smoking pot and needed the gatefold cover to clean the seat.
In 1957 was the year that Elvis bought Graceland, and I think that made the Stools want to step up their game a bit, just to see what they could accomplish.
Mr. DJ, I know you can't hear me, but good morning anyway.
A year earlier, Johnny Cash had dragged a young Roy Orbison into Sun Studios and talked Sam Phillips into recording the kid. They came up with his first single, Ooby Dooby, which did well enough, and Roy and his band, the Teen Kings, went out on the road for a little touring. But after the third single, Devil Doll, failed to do anything, the band broke up.
Phillips put Orbison and Elvin Anderson in the studio and recorded a few more singles, but nothing seems to click. The rockabilly doesn't seem to work too well with Orbison's high falsetto.
The sessions with Roy Orbison went so poorly that Roy quit performing live music and moved to Nashville to work on his songwriting. So in Nashville, on April 23rd at Roy's 21st birthday party, who shows up but Elvin Anderson and the other Stools? But more importantly, Lou Chudd was there. Lou is a friend of David Bartholomew's, and he had been present at that ill-fated post-Lottie Miss Claudie recording session of Elvin's at J&M Studios.
Lou Chudd knew Elvin and wanted to work with him. Of course, Chudd, now owner of Imperial Records, had just stolen Ricky Nelson away from Verve Records for $250,000.
Lou Chudd thought that Ricky Nelson's squeaky clean image could use a little of the Stools' grunge. So he hired them to play backup on his album Ricky. He was right. Nelson scored 20 top 40 hits over the next 6 years on Chudd's Imperial Records.
Ozzie Nelson, Ricky's dad, had made a deal with Fender Guitars to sponsor Ricky on their TV show. Al Floss made a deal for the Stools to play on Ricky's album in exchange for short money and a pile of guitars.
The Ricky Nelson album was just a collection of derivative standards, long before Rod Stewart thought of doing it. Am I Blue? Have I Told You Lately That I Love You? Some Cole Porter given a rock twist? The songs were arranged by Chico Marx's old guitar player, Barney Kessel, who would later go on to become a member of the legendary Wrecking Crew in LA. And Elvin would pitch him several songs, which were rejected, but eventually wound up on the Stools' second album.
The sessions with Ricky Nelson went well, but by the time they were done with it, Ricky Nelson had stole Antonio's girlfriend, and that didn't sit too well.
Back in the early 50s, there was this great brother and sister act, the Collins Kids. They played smoke and rockabilly.
The Collins Kids were geared for a younger demo, children's music, with songs like Hop, Skip, and Jump.
Hoy Hoy was one of the Collins Kids' songs. Great stuff. The brother, Larry, played a double-neck guitar like his hero Joe Maphis. The sister, Laurie, was linked romantically with Antonio briefly. But the story goes that Ricky Nelson took a shine to her and stole her away by offering her a spot on the Ozzie and Harriet TV show as the girlfriend.
The Collins Kids broke up, but the brother, Larry Collins, went on to write Delta Dawn, among other songs.
To add insult to injury, a couple of years later, Antonio was up for the part of Colorado in John Wayne's Rio Bravo. However, that part went to Ricky Nelson too.
Ricky's debut album was the #1 album of 1957 which tells you a lot about the power of television at the time.
Looking back now, would I say Ricky was the best album of 1957? Nah, I'd say Sophomore Slump was better. Was Sophomore Slump the best album of 1957? But was it the best rock and roll album of 1957? Again, no. Here's Little Richard, and Chuck Berry's After School Sessions also came out that year. But it was a pretty dang good album. After all, it's got I Wish I Had Your Mama on it.
I wish I had your mama. You're such a lucky kid. I wish I had your mama. That's right, I did. See, you were busy sleeping. I got you a dreaming of sugar plum.
1957, Elvin Anderson was reading a lot of Leonard Cohen poetry. Wasn't interested in Leonard Cohen's music, but at the time Cohen was fronting a Canadian square dance band, so that's understandable. But he had also published a book of poetry, and Anderson soaked it right up. It was around this time that Al Floss booked him into the Reeperbahn in Hamburg, Germany.
1957 was also the year of the Asian flu pandemic, caused by a mutation in wild ducks. The death toll would go over 70,000 in the US. Al Floss thought the band might be more safe in Germany. Less ducks, I guess.
Floss asked them to write a song in German, something that the drunk Germans could sing along with, and they could sell the single from the stage during their stay in the Reeperbahn.
The Reeperbahn is, of course, the St. Pauli or red light district of Hamburg. Made very famous back in the 60s by the Beatles. Howsomever, long before the Beatles, the area was famous for its strip clubs, brothels, sex shops, and bars. Pretty much an anything-goes, Wild West sort of place.
Hamburg had been the fourth largest city in the world before World War II, but by 1943 it was really just a little more than a pile of rubble, thanks to the Allied bombing raids. This sort of mecca for public sex and depravity rose from the ashes like a Randy Phoenix.
So the Stools recorded Mach and Schau for their stay in Germany.
Things were looking sad at the big garden. The Allies were knocking at the gate. Deutschland need to find a new dance grade and a new dictator to dictate. Because they said dancing would make things better. And see us through these rough times. Keep our family safe from the Russians and keep us from getting charged with war crimes. Come on, everybody! Smoke show! Smoke show! It's a crazy little thing we can do. You just shoot a step on the one and do your smoke show. Smoke show, smoke show. You do the mashed potato and the grenade. Find a little country, Julian Bay, smoke show. When things were looking darker for the pure.
Normally this song would have been offensive to the defeated German people, but the dance break was so catchy, no one ever complained.
He tried out the pills on his dog Blondie, and even Blondier, Eva Blondie, what she told. She danced the Mark Show, Mark Show. Round there, left to look that time, shuffle along with the cyanide, Mark Show.
The song's structure owes a lot to Jayhawk's Stranded in the Jungle, which had come out a year earlier.
Stranded in the Jungle was a great song. The Jayhawks' James Johnson wrote it, and they put it out first. But as we know about the 50s, everybody covers songs in every style and every way they can think of to make a buck.
In '56, Stranded in the Jungle was covered by the Rhythm Rockets, the Johnson Brothers. The Cadets had a doo-wop version, and the Gadabouts covered one too.
The Cadets version is the one that people know most. It had Dub Jones, who went on to sing bass in the Coasters, and he did the spoken word part of the song.
The Fearsome Foursome covered Stranded in the Jungle. Jet Powers had a version, Shorty Long. No wonder it influenced the Stools. Everybody loved that song.
The New York Dolls had their outstanding cover of Stranded in the Jungle, and David Johansen liked it so much that he even put it on a couple of his solo albums after the band had broken up. The Nylons, Crazy Joe and the Variable Speed Band, Commander Cody, Voodoo Glow Skulls have all covered it. Even Frank Zappa played it on his 1976 American tour.
The best Stranded in the Jungle story was 2003, Adam Ant. Adam Ant is working on this project to raise awareness about the plight of the mountain gorilla in Central Africa. Apparently they're endangered or something, so he plans on putting out this 5-song EP featuring a cover of Stranded in the Jungle and a reworking of his song, Stand and Deliver. Only the words are changed to Save the Gorilla. 2 days before it's supposed to come out, Adam's old bandmate and co-writer Marco blocks the release of the song, killing the project. Now, I don't know if Marco just hates gorillas or hates Adam Ant or what, but Adam's version of Stranded in the Jungle is one of those best lost classics that you'll never get to hear.
If I could get back to the Reeperbahn for a moment. It started out in the 50s with a bunch of jazz clubs. But as British sailors came in on leave, they wanted to hear rock and roll. The Kaiserkeller's owner, Bruno Kochschmiller, put together a group he called the Jets to fill the need, and their guitar player, Tony Sheridan, became somewhat of a local rock star, even recording some songs with the Beatles backing him up several years later.
Rather than letting the locals embarrass themselves by trying to play rock and roll, Bruno started importing British bands. The Swingin' Blue Jeans, Billy J. Kramer, The Searchers. So you can imagine how excited they were when an American rock and roll band like the Stools showed up to play there.
The shows could get very rowdy with the crowds yelling, "Mach schon, Mach schon," to egg them on. There's that famous picture of John Lennon with the toilet seat around his neck while he sang there a few years later with the Beatles.
There were very few things the people in the Reeperbahn hadn't seen, but the Stools managed to horrify even the locals.
Well, this was long before the cell phone, so we don't have any video of them playing in Germany, but considering that they got kicked out of the country for employing an underage donkey, I think we can fill in the blanks.
Playing Germany was a smart move by Al Floss, taking the band international. 1957 was the last year in history that all of the top 10 artists of the year were Americans.
By the late 1960s, local German bands got good enough at rock and roll that they didn't need outside bands to come in, and the scene fell apart.
Al Floss wanted to head over to Iran, where he knew a bunch of promoters. But just that summer, Iran had officially banned rock and roll, declaring dancing to be harmful to your health.
The Minister of Communications in Cuba bans rock and roll from Cuban TV stations. While in the US, rock and roll was getting so popular, the Jehovah's Witness station, WBBR in Staten Island, flips to rock and roll.
Stools albums were starting to be bootlegged in places like Russia and Poland, where they would cut these albums on discarded hospital x-ray plates and sell them for about 50 rubles a piece in places like Leningrad. That's like $12 American money. Same single, sold here, cut on vinyl, less than $1.
Oh yeah, there was this whole Soviet movement called Stilyaji, Rabbit fans.
Now, I know Al Floss looked into getting the boys to go to Russia, and Foreign Minister Sheplev was a friend, but then Gromyko took over, and he's a sourpuss.
Al Floss had some scheme for the Stools to play at the opening of the Suez Canal.
There was talk of the band playing under the pyramids after their stint at the Reeperbahn. But in June, Egypt banned all rock and roll from public places, deeming it an imperialist plot and citing it as a prime example of Western degeneracy. Which is just as well, because Elvin told the press that he thought the pyramids were a symbol of slavery and repression, ironically, all the while wearing a Confederate flag belt buckle.
They may be right about Western degeneracy, because in June, RCA signed Harry Belafonte to an unprecedented $1 million.
People always ask me, what kind of money were the Stools making? Well, the average working stiff in 1957 was making $3,600 a year, and the Stools were making much more than that. They got nothing to complain about, let me tell you.
Decca Records reported record profits in 1956, somewhere around 26 million, mostly due in part to hits like See You Later Alligator from Bill Haley. Even Disneyland Records reported that they were going to hit the $5 million mark. They weren't even trying.
Antonio Moretti famously said, "I could make more money playing on rigged game shows than I can playing rock and roll."
Of course, Errol Flynn had just won $3,000 on the TV game show Big Surprise for correctly identifying the 4 methods of navigation: landmarks, radar, and dead reckoning, and the other one. Of course, Charles Van Doren also won $122,000 on the rigged 21.
You'd like to think that money grubbing wasn't around in the 50s, that it was a cleaner, simpler time, but Mickey Mantle wouldn't re-sign with the Yankees because they weren't offering enough money. They finally settled for $60,000. Roy Campanella got his pay cut by $5,000 by the Dodgers because he got hurt. Art Carney left the Jackie Gleason show over money. Webb Pierce left the Grand Ole Opry because he's sick of them shaking him down for commissions on outside bookings.
Howsomever, money was getting tight around Dutchco Records. Al Floss took a big hit on the Chimbombo swindle of 1957. Chimbombo was discovered along the Medellina River in Colombia and was said to be superior in both aroma and taste to coffee. And at 3 cents a pound, it was going to be a sure winner.
Al Floss got on the ground floor of Chimbombo, so he'd invest almost all of his money and almost all of the band's money into Chimbombo. Turns out, Chimbombo is just okra. And we all know no matter how you grind it or how you toast it, it just makes a pretty crappy drink.
Unable to get their world tour off the ground, the Stools, strapped for cash, came home from Germany and started working on their sophomore slump album.
Antonio Moretti's sax is conspicuously absent from the Sophomore Slump album because as Elvin and Cosmo began working on the album, Antonio decided to take the month of June off and head to Hollywood to try and make it as an actor. Most notably, he can be seen as one of the background dancers during the Jailhouse Rock number in the Elvis Presley movie of the same name.
Tragically, after production of Jailhouse Rock wrapped, Antonio was behind the wheel of his car when he hit a truck carrying canned hams just north of Route 287 in Rock River, Wyoming. And the impact immediately killed his passenger, the film's co-star, Judy Tyler, perhaps best known as Princess Summerfall Winterspring from the Howdy Doody Show.
It's unclear what Moretti and the recently married Judy Tyler were doing in Wyoming. But when Antonio was released by the state troopers, he limped back to the band on the East Coast, rather than face the wrath of Elvis, a huge Howdy Doody fan, who was said to have been so upset by Tyler's death, he was never able to watch the completed film.
So while Antonio is in Hollywood, Elvin and Cosmo are working on the new album. In my opinion, one of the better songs on the second album, Old Orange Juice.
You're so lucky I'm a gentleman, one makes house calls.
forget to take your medicine. Yo, a fiend bob at all. No more calling me at work just because your day got banal. There's so many meanings for Bert, baby, y'all. A fiend bob at all.
So Elvin comes out of this old Kirk Douglas movie, Lust for Life, which inspired him to write the song Old Orange Juice.
The film was about Van Gogh and his zeal for God and his social activism, but I don't really hear much of that kind of thing in Orange Juice. Maybe the part where Van Gogh moves in with a hooker and then she leaves him because he's too poor, but even that's a stretch.
I do hear Van Gogh in the song. The blue period, the hallucinations, the seizures, the shooting himself because he won't be able to see what he sees in his head and his art. But I may be reading into it a little too much.
Another movie said to inspire a song off of the Stools' second album was Baby Doll with Eli Wallach and Carol Baker.
Well, I'm looking for a girl that knows how to rock and roll. It's not a shop at college and let's face it, a little too old. A senior would be great, a junior would raise my heart rate, but anything else would have to wait, they say obey. But how she
1957 was what you might call the halcyon days of the Stools. The only real problem was Antonio Moretti tried to sue Old Spice because they had just come out with the slogan, brisk as an ocean breeze, as their tagline, and Antonio once said in an interview that Old Spice smelled like low tide and he thought they were just ripping him off. But of course, as with any band, things were about to get darker.
How dark? Find out next time when we look at 1958 and the album Dropping the Kids Off at the Pool as the complete and alarming history of America's greatest garage band, the Stools, continues. Join us then, won't you?
stroll right up the whole place. Now I'm serving time off stage. She say obey.